Edward Sullivan stood at the edge of his empire, 62 floors above the pulsing heart of New York City. The glass wall of his corner office framed a view that never failed to stir him, a sprawling grid of lights, steel, and ambition bending to the will of men like him. At 62 years old, the chairman of Sullivan Energy wore his success like a tailored suit, sharp, impeccable, untouchable. Today, he'd just sealed $1 billion deal to power half the eastern seaboard, and the quiet hum of victory thrummed in his chest. He adjusted his cufflinks, silver and understated, and allowed himself a rare, thin smile. This was the pinnacle, he thought. The cold, glittering pinnacle of a life built on discipline and sacrifice. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking the silence. Edward's assistant Claire spoke through the intercom, her voice clipped and professional. "Sir, there's a woman downstairs insisting on seeing you. She's with a boy in a wheelchair. Says her name is Anna." The name hit him like a gust of wind through an open window, sharp, unexpected, chilling. Anna. His hand froze mid-motion, hovering over the cufflink. 15 years had passed since he'd last heard that name spoken aloud, since he'd walked away from her tear-streaked face in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. Anna, his ex-wife, the woman he'd left behind because she couldn't, or wouldn't, fit into the world he was clawing his way toward. He'd buried her in the past, a footnote in the ledger of his rise to power. What could she possibly want now? "Tell her I'm busy," he said, his tone flat, controlled. He turned back to the window, willing the city lights to steady his pulse. "She says it's urgent, sir," Claire replied. "She won't leave. Security's asking if they should escort her out." Edward's jaw tightened. The last thing he needed was a scene in the lobby of Sullivan Energy's headquarters, a gleaming marble fortress where every employee knew his name and his reputation. He prided himself on control, on the ability to keep chaos at bay. A public confrontation would be a crack in that armor, a whisper of weakness. He exhaled slowly, mastering the flicker of unease in his chest. "Fine. Send her up, but make it quick." Minutes later, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Edward turned to face the past he tried so hard to forget. Anna stepped into the office, older now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face etched with lines that spoke of years he hadn't witnessed. She wore a faded coat, practical and plain, a stark contrast to the polished elegance of his world. Behind her, she guided a boy in a wheelchair, thin, pale, with sharp eyes that darted around the room before settling on Edward. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, a quiet intensity in his gaze. Edward's breath caught, just for a moment. Those eyes. They were his eyes, hazel, piercing, unyielding. A jolt of recognition shot through him, but he shoved it down, locking it behind the steel wall of his composure. He straightened, folding his arms across his chest. "What do you want, Anna?" "Money." Her lips pressed into a hard line, and for a second, he saw the old fire flare in her eyes, the same fire that had once drawn him to her, back when he was just a scrappy engineer with big dreams. "No, Edward," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the air like a blade. "I don't need your money. I need you to look into this boy's eyes." The boy, Tommy, she'd called him downstairs, tilted his head slightly, studying Edward with a curiosity that felt unnervingly familiar. Edward's mind raced, calculating, resisting. Could it be? No. He'd left Anna before anything like that could happen. Or had he? The timeline blurred in his memory, clouded by the haze of ambition that had consumed him back then. He forced his gaze back to Anna, keeping his expression impassive. "Why are you here? After all this time?" "Because you need to see," she said simply, her words carrying a weight he couldn't ignore. She stepped aside, giving him an unobstructed view of Tommy. The boy's hands tightened on the wheelchair, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was a question, a challenge, a mirror held up to Edward's carefully constructed life. Edward's throat tightened, but he swallowed the discomfort. He wouldn't let her unravel him. Not here, not in the heart of his empire, with Claire hovering discreetly by the door and the city watching from below. "You think showing up like this changes anything?" he asked, his voice low, measured. "I gave you everything I could back then. You didn't want it." Anna's eyes narrowed, and her response was a quiet thunderclap. "No, Edward. You gave me what you thought I should want. I asked for a husband. You gave me a check and walked away." The words stung, sharper than he'd expected, piercing the shield of his self-assurance. He remembered that night, rain pounding the roof of their tiny apartment, her voice breaking as she begged him to stay, his own curt dismissal as he chose the promise of power over her tears. He'd told himself it was for the best, that she'd hold him back. Now, standing in his glass tower, he felt the first tremor of doubt. Had he been wrong? He glanced at Tommy again, those hazel eyes boring into him, and the doubt grew claws. What if this boy was his? What if Anna had carried a piece of him all these years, alone, while he built an empire on the ashes of their life together? The thought threatened to crack his composure, but he clenched his fists, forcing it back. He was Edward Sullivan, master of his fate, unshakable. He wouldn't let her see him falter. "Say what you came to say, Anna," he said, his tone clipped, authoritative. "I have a company to run." She didn't flinch. "Look at him, Edward. Really look. That's all I ask." Then she turned the wheelchair, guiding Tommy toward the elevator without another word. The doors closed behind them, leaving Edward alone with the echo of her voice and the weight of those unspoken eyes. He stood there, staring at the empty space where they'd been, his reflection shimmering in the glass wall. The city glittered below, a kingdom he'd conquered, but for the first time in years it felt hollow. His honor, the cold, polished honor of a man who'd never bent, suddenly seemed fragile, teetering on the edge of a truth he wasn't ready to face. Edward Sullivan sat alone in his Manhattan penthouse, the city's skyline sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a constellation of his own making. The room was a study in luxury, sleek leather furniture, a marble bar gleaming under recessed lights, a single abstract painting worth more than most people's homes. Tonight, though, the opulence felt sterile, a hollow shell around the memory Anna had dragged back into his life. He poured a finger of scotch into a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it. He didn't drink often. Discipline was his religion. But tonight he needed something to steady the tremor in his hands. Anna. Tommy. Those hazel eyes that mirrored his own. The encounter in his office had left a splinter in his mind, sharp and unrelenting. He'd spent 15 years building Sullivan Energy into a titan of industry, each victory a brick in the wall that separated him from the man he'd once been. A man who'd loved Anna, fiercely and imperfectly until ambition had eclipsed that love. Now she'd walked back into his world, not with anger or demands, but with a quiet dignity that cut deeper than any accusation. He closed his eyes, and the past rushed in like a storm. It was a rainy night in Brooklyn 15 years ago, the air thick with the scent of wet asphalt and regret. Anna stood in their cramped apartment, her hands clutching the edge of the kitchen table, her voice trembling but resolute. "Stay, Edward. We can make this work. I don't need the world. Just you." He'd been packing a suitcase, his engineering degree still fresh, his dreams of power burning brighter than her pleas. "I can't live small like this, Anna," he'd said, his tone cold, final. "You'll hold me back." She'd cried then, soft and broken, but he'd walked out anyway, the rain swallowing her sobs as he closed the door. Edward opened his eyes, the memory stinging like salt in an old wound. He'd told himself she'd move on, find someone else, someone content with a modest life. He'd never looked back, not once. But now, here she was, with a boy who might be his son. A boy in a wheelchair who carried his eyes. The possibility gnawed at him, a quiet threat to the honor he'd built on discipline and control. He set the scotch down, untouched, and picked up his phone. "Claire," he said when his assistant answered, his voice steady despite the churn. In his gut. "Find out everything you can about Anna Sullivan, where she lives, what she does, Who she's with. Discreetly. Yes, sir, Claire replied, efficient as ever. Anything else? No, just get it done. He hung up, leaning back in his chair. Knowledge was power. He'd learned that long ago. If Anna thought she could unsettle him, she'd underestimated the man he'd become. By morning, Claire's report arrived via encrypted email. Edward scanned it at his desk, the penthouse silent save for the faint hum of the city below. Anna lived in a rundown apartment in Queens, worked double shifts as a nurse's aide, and spent her nights caring for the boy Tommy, age 12. No husband, no partner, just her and the kid. The report included a photo. Anna, tired but resolute, helping Tommy into a battered van, her hands gentle on his shoulders. Edward stared at it, his chest tightening. She'd been alone all this time, scraping by while he dined with senators and slept in silk sheets. He needed answers. Not here, though. Not in the sterile glow of his penthouse. He arranged to meet her at a discreet cafe downtown, a place where the elite didn't linger. When he arrived, Anna was already there, sitting at a corner table, with Tommy beside her. The boy's wheelchair was parked close, his thin fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. Edward approached, his tailored coat brushing the chair as he sat, his posture rigid with control. "Why now, Anna?" he asked, skipping pleasantries. His voice was low, measured, a shield against the storm brewing inside him. "After all these years, why show up now?" Anna met his gaze, unflinching. "Because Tommy deserves to know where he comes from," she said, her words soft but weighted. "Not your money, not your name, just the truth." "And what truth is that?" Edward pressed, his tone sharpening despite his effort to stay calm. "You think you can waltz in and unravel everything I've built?" She shook her head, a faint, sad smile tugging at her lips. "I'm not here to unravel anything, Edward. You did that yourself when you walked away." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's all I have. You don't need to know more than that. Not yet." Edward's eyes flicked. To Tommy. The boy was watching him, quiet and steady, his fingers still on the table. There it was again, those hazel eyes, a reflection of his own, piercing through the layers of pride he'd stacked so carefully. His mind raced, piecing together the timeline. 15 years ago, that last night before he left. Had it been enough? Had Anna known she was pregnant when he walked out? The thought was a blade, slicing at the core of his self-respect. If it was true, he'd abandoned more than a wife. He'd abandoned a son. He leaned back, forcing his breathing to slow, his hands resting calmly on the table. He wouldn't let her see the turmoil, wouldn't give her that power. "If you're hiding something, Anna, I'll find out," he said, his voice a steel thread. "You can't keep it from me forever." She didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. "I'm not hiding you, Edward," she replied, her tone achingly calm. "You chose not to see. You still can if you want to." She stood then, guiding Tommy's wheelchair toward the door. "But it's your choice, not mine." The cafe door swung shut behind them, and Edward sat there, the hum of the room fading into a distant roar. He stared at his hands, strong, steady, the hands of a man who'd built an empire, and felt them tremble just for a second. The honor he'd clung to, the cold dignity of his success, suddenly felt like a fragile mask. Anna hadn't come for revenge or money. She'd come for something far more dangerous, the truth. And as he watched the city lights flicker beyond the cafe window, Edward knew that truth might be the one thing he couldn't control. Edward Sullivan paced the polished hardwood floor of his penthouse, the city lights beyond the windows casting jagged shadows across his face. Sleep had eluded him since the cafe, Anna's words looping in his mind like a relentless echo. "You chose not to see." The scotch sat untouched on the bar, a testament to his iron will. He wouldn't let this crack him, not yet. But the boy's eyes, those hazel mirrors of his own, gnawed at the edges of his composure. He needed facts, not feelings. Facts he could master. Claire's updated report had arrived at dawn, a thin file delivered by courier. Edward sat at his desk, the leather chair creaking under his weight, and flipped it open. The details were sparse but brutal. Anna worked 16-hour shifts at a nursing home, lived in a one-bedroom walk-up with peeling paint, and spent every spare moment with Tommy. The boy had been in a wheelchair since age 3, paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident. Edward's fingers tightened on the page. An accident. He pictured Anna, exhausted, hunched over a steering wheel, and a cold weight settled in his chest. He needed to hear it from her, not through reports or guesses, but straight from the source. He called her, his voice clipped and professional when she answered. "Meet me again, Anna. Same place, 1 hour." She hesitated, then agreed, her tone weary but firm. The cafe was quieter this time, the morning crowd thinning out. Anna sat across from him, Tommy at her side, his wheelchair tucked close to the table. Edward studied her, lines etched deep around her eyes, hands rough from years of labor. She was a shadow of the woman he'd loved, yet stronger somehow, forged by a life he'd never known. He leaned forward, keeping his voice low, controlled. "Tell me about the accident, Anna. What happened to him?" Her gaze flickered to Tommy, then back to Edward, steady and unflinching. "It was a long time ago," she said, her words measured. "I was driving home from a double shift. Tommy was in the back seat. I fell asleep at the wheel, just for a second. We hit a guardrail. He's been like this ever since." Edward's breath caught, but he masked it with a slow nod. "You were working too hard," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. "Why?" Anna's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice soft but cutting. "Because I had to. Because I was alone, Edward. You left, and I had a child to raise." The words landed like a blow, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. Not here. Not in front of her. "You could have asked for help," he said, his tone even, though his pulse hammered. "You knew where to find me." Her eyes darkened, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a decade. "I did ask, Edward. 10 years ago I wrote you a letter. I begged you to come back, not for me, for him. I sent it to your office. You never answered." Edward froze, his mind racing to catch up. A letter. 10 years ago he'd been climbing the ranks at Sullivan Energy, every day a battle for control. He hadn't seen any letter. "I never got it," he said, his voice hardening despite his effort to stay calm. "You're lying." Anna's gaze held his, unyielding. "I'm not. I sent it. You chose not to see." The accusation hung between them, heavy and sharp. Edward's hands clenched under the table, but he kept his face impassive, his breathing steady. He wouldn't let her unravel him, not yet. "If you sent it, it didn't reach me," he said, each word deliberate. "I'd have remembered something like that." She didn't argue, just watched him with those quiet, knowing eyes. Tommy shifted in his chair, his small voice breaking the tension. "Mom says you're busy a lot," he said, his tone curious, not bitter. "Is that why?" Edward looked at the boy, his son maybe, and felt a crack widen in his armor. "Yes," he said, softer than he intended. "I've been busy." Anna stood, guiding Tommy's wheelchair toward the door. "Think about it, Edward," she said over her shoulder. "Think about why you never saw it." Back in his office, Edward dialed Victor Crane, his former right-hand man at Sullivan Energy, now a rival consultant with a grudge. Victor had handled his correspondence a decade ago, back when Edward was too consumed with boardroom wars to sift through mail. The line rang twice before Victor's smooth, smug voice answered. "Edward, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Did you see a letter from Anna 10 years ago?" Edward asked, his tone flat, betraying nothing. "She says she sent one." A pause, then a low chuckle. "Oh, that. Yeah, I saw it. Tearful little thing. Her begging you to play daddy. I figured you didn't need the distraction. You were on your way up, Ed. Couldn't let a sob story drag you down." Edward's vision blurred with a surge of rage, but he clamped it down, his voice ice cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you didn't deserve that chair if you couldn't handle it," Victor said, his smugness palpable. "I saved you from yourself. You're welcome." Edward's hand tightened on the phone, knuckles white, but he didn't raise his voice. He wouldn't give Victor the satisfaction. "You had no right," he said, each word a blade. "That was my choice, not yours." Victor laughed again. "Keep telling yourself that. Good luck with your mess, Ed." The line went dead. Edward set the phone down, his hands trembling despite his will to still them. The letter, Anna's plea, Tommy's lifeline, had been real, and Victor had buried it. 10 years ago, Anna had reached out, and he'd failed her, not by choice, but by ignorance. The realization was a fist to his gut, threatening the dignity he'd spent a lifetime building. He'd left her to struggle, left a boy, his boy, to suffer, all while he'd climbed to this cold pinnacle. He stood, walking to the window, the city sprawling below like a kingdom he'd won at too high a cost. His honor, his self-respect, felt tarnished, not by Anna's words, but by the truth she'd forced him to face. He hadn't seen the letter, but he hadn't looked either, and now, that failure stared back at him, demanding an answer he wasn't ready to give. Edward Sullivan stood in the doorway of Anna's apartment, the peeling paint and faint smell of mildew, a stark rebuke to the polished world he'd built. It was a Saturday morning, the city outside buzzing with life, but here, in this cramped Queen's walk-up, time seemed to hang heavy. He'd come unannounced, a box of art supplies tucked under his arm, paints, brushes, a sketch pad, after Claire's report mentioned Tommy's love for drawing. It was a calculated move, a way to test the waters without surrendering his guard. He knocked, his knuckles firm against the chipped wood, and waited. Anna opened the door, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness. She wore a faded sweater, her hair pulled back, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Edward," she said, her voice flat. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see him," he replied, keeping his tone even, his posture straight. "I brought something for Tommy." He lifted the box slightly, a peace offering wrapped in practicality. Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for ulterior motives, but she stepped aside. "He's in the living room, don't expect much." The apartment was small, cluttered with the evidence of a hard-lived life. A sagging couch, a stack of medical bills on the table, a worn rug underfoot. Tommy sat by the window, his wheelchair angled toward the light, a pencil scratching across, a scrap of paper. He looked up as Edward entered, those hazel eyes locking onto him with an intensity that made Edward's chest tighten. He set the box on the table and approached, careful not to loom. "Hi, Tommy," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "I heard you like to draw. Thought you might want these." Tommy tilted his head, studying the box. Then Edward. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Mom says you're important, are you?" The question caught Edward off guard, a child's bluntness piercing through his armor. He glanced at Anna, who watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "I suppose so," he said, choosing his words with care. "I run a company. It keeps me busy." Tommy nodded as if that explained everything, and reached for the box. Edward pulled a chair closer, sitting at eye level, a rare concession for a man used to standing above others. "What do you draw?" he asked, his tone steady, masking the curiosity burning inside. "Stuff I see," Tommy said, unpacking the paints with small, deliberate movements. "Sometimes stuff I wish I could see." Edward watched him, the boy's hands moving with a grace that belied his condition. He'd come to probe, to confirm what Anna wouldn't say, but now, sitting here, he felt something shift. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. He couldn't demand answers. He had to wait, to earn them. "Can I see one?" he asked, keeping his voice light. Tommy hesitated, then handed him a crumpled sheet from the table. Edward smoothed it out, and his breath caught. It was a pencil sketch. A man in a suit, standing under a street lamp, his face shadowed but his posture rigid, solitary. The lines were simple, childlike, yet the loneliness radiated from the page. "Who's this?" Edward asked, though he already knew. "Dunno," Tommy said, shrugging. "Just someone I thought of." He looked strong, but kinda sad. Edward's throat tightened, but he kept his face impassive, his hands steady as he set the drawing down. It was him, or how Tommy saw him, a stranger glimpsed through a lens of innocence. He wanted to ask, to press, to know if Anna had told the boy anything, but he held back. Dignity demanded patience, not force. "It's good," he said instead, his voice low. "Really good." Tommy smiled, a small fleeting thing, and Edward felt a pang he couldn't name. He turned to Anna, who still stood watching, her expression unreadable. "He's talented," he said, a statement, not a plea. "He is," she agreed, her tone neutral. "He gets that from somewhere." The words hung there, a quiet challenge, and Edward met her gaze. He could have pushed. "Is he mine, Anna? Tell me now." But he didn't. Not yet. He'd spent a lifetime mastering his impulses, and he wouldn't lose that now, not in front of her, not in front of the boy. Instead, he picked up the sketch pad and handed it to Tommy. "Why don't you try the paints? I'll help if you want." Tommy nodded, and for the next hour, Edward sat beside him, awkward at first, then steady. He held the paper still, as Tommy dipped brushes into color, reds and blues streaking across the page. He told stories, carefully curated tales of business trips, planes soaring over oceans, cities glittering below, his voice softening with each word. Tommy listened, painting silently, and Edward felt the distance between them shrink inch by inch. As the sun dipped lower, Tommy paused, his brush hovering. "Mr. Edward," he said, his voice tentative, "do you ever wish you could go back? Like, to fix stuff?" The question was a knife, slipping through Edward's defenses, but he didn't flinch. He looked into those hazel eyes, his eyes, and felt the weight of a decade's neglect press against his ribs. "Sometimes," he said, his tone calm, honest. "But you can't always go back. You just try to do better now." Tommy nodded, as if that made sense, and returned to his painting. Edward glanced at Anna, who'd moved closer, her arms uncrossed now, her eyes softer. "He understands more than you think," she said quietly. "Be careful what you promise. Him." Edward stood, smoothing his coat, his composure intact but his heart unsteady. "I'm not promising anything," he said, meeting her gaze. "Not yet." She didn't reply, just watched as he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Outside, the city air was crisp, biting, but Edward barely felt it. Tommy's drawing burned in his mind, the lonely man under the lamp, strong but sad. It was a truth he couldn't unsee, a reflection of the honor he'd chased at the cost of everything else. He'd come to test Anna, to test the boy, but now he wondered if the test was his own, and whether he'd pass it with the dignity he'd always claimed. Edward Sullivan stood at the podium in the Sullivan Energy press room, the glare of camera flashes slicing through the air like blades. The room buzzed with reporters, their voices a low hum of anticipation, pens poised over notebooks, microphones thrust forward. He'd called this conference himself, a calculated move to seize control of the chaos that had erupted overnight. The headline screamed across every major outlet, "Billionaire Edward Sullivan's secret son?" A grainy photo of him with Anna and Tommy at the cafe had ignited the firestorm, and now the flames licked at the edges of his empire. He adjusted his tie, the silk smooth under his fingers, and cleared his throat. His face was a mask of calm, jaw set, eyes steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside. Victor Crane had done this. He knew it. The man's smug voice from their last call echoed in his mind. "Good luck with your mess, Ed." This was revenge, pure and calculated, a strike at Edward's honor meant to topple him from the pedestal he'd spent decades building. The board had called an emergency meeting, demanding answers. Clients threatened to pull contracts. His legacy teetered on the brink. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice deep, measured, cutting through the noise. "I'm here to address the rumors circulating about my personal life. I'll keep this brief." He'd rehearsed the denial in his office that morning, the words crisp and clinical. "The claims are baseless. I have no knowledge of this child. This is a private matter, and I ask for your respect." It was the safe play. Protect the company, shield his reputation, let Anna and Tommy fade back into the shadows. He'd convinced himself it was enough, that dignity lay in maintaining the status quo. But as he scanned the room, his gaze caught on a figure at the back, Anna, standing beside Tommy's wheelchair, her face pale but resolute. The sight hit him like a punch, unraveling his script. Tommy's hazel eyes met his, wide and searching, not with judgment but with a quiet, unguarded hope. Edward's throat tightened, his hands gripping the podium's edge. He saw the boardroom in his mind, stern faces, whispered doubts, and Victor's smirk lurking behind it all. He could deny it, walk away clean, let Anna bear the burden alone again. But then he saw Tommy's drawing, the lonely man under the lamp, and the weight of 10 lost years pressed down on him. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, mastering the tremor in his chest. Dignity wasn't in the lie, he realized. It was in the truth, no matter the cost. "The rumors are true," he said, his voice steady, resonant. "Tommy is my son. I didn't know until recently. But that doesn't change the fact. He's mine, and I'll take responsibility for him." The room erupted. Shouts, clicks, a frenzy of questions. But Edward stood tall, unshaken. He'd faced hostile takeovers, market crashes and betrayals, always with the same steely resolve. This was no different. Except it was. This wasn't about power or profit. It was about a boy who deserved more than his silence, a woman who'd carried the load he'd refused. He raised a hand, silencing the clamor with quiet authority. "That's all I have to say. No further comments." He stepped down, ignoring the barrage of voices, and made his way toward Anna and Tommy. Reporters swarmed, but he moved through them like a ship cutting through waves, his focus singular. Anna's eyes were stormy when he reached her, her arms crossed tight. "What the hell was that, Edward?" she hissed, her voice low but fierce. "You don't get to decide this for us." "I didn't decide for you," he said, keeping his tone calm, though his pulse raced. "I decided for me. He's my son, Anna. I won't deny him." "You think saying it makes it true?" she snapped, her restraint cracking. "You didn't ask me. You didn't ask him. You just stood up there and made it about you like always." Her words stung, sharp and deserved, but Edward didn't flinch. He'd spent a lifetime controlling his temper, and he wouldn't lose it now, not when she was right to be angry. He looked at Tommy, who watched them silently, his small hands clenched on the wheelchair. "Tommy," Edward said, crouching, to meet his gaze, his voice softening. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I should have." "Why didn't I?" The boy blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to something raw. "Mom said you were busy," he said, his voice small. "Too busy for us?" Edward's chest ached, but he kept his face steady, his hands resting lightly on his knees. "I was," he admitted, the honesty cutting deeper than any camera flash. "Too busy with things that didn't matter as much as I thought. I'm here now, though, if you'll let me be." Tommy didn't answer, just looked at him, those hazel eyes searching for something Edward wasn't sure he could give. Anna grabbed the wheelchair's handles, her movements sharp. "We're leaving," she said, her tone final. "You don't get to fix this with a speech." She pushed past him, Tommy glancing back once before they disappeared into the crowd. Edward stood, the chaos of the room swirling around him, but he felt oddly still. He'd lost the board's trust, risked his company, and alienated Anna, all in one move. Yet he didn't regret it. For the first time in years, he'd acted not for power or pride, but for something greater. A truth he couldn't outrun. Back in his office, the phone rang incessantly. Board members, lawyers, PR. But he let it go to voicemail. He sank into his chair, the city skyline stretching before him, a kingdom he'd fought for and might now lose. Victor had won this round, turned his past into a weapon, but Edward wouldn't retaliate. not with fists or fury. That wasn't his way. He'd faced the fallout with the same discipline that had carried him this far, but now with a purpose he'd forgotten. To prove to Tommy, to Anna, to himself, that honor wasn't a title or a fortune. It was the courage to stand by what mattered, even when the lights burned brightest. He picked up the photo Claire had sent, Anna helping Tommy into their van, and traced the boy's face with his thumb. "I'll do better," he murmured, a vow to the silence. The storm was coming, but he'd weather it, not for glory, but for the son he'd finally claimed. Edward Sullivan stood outside Anna's Queen's apartment, the late afternoon sky heavy, with the promise of rain. He'd left his penthouse behind that morning, trading its sterile luxury for a duffel bag and a resolve he hadn't felt in years. The press conference fallout still echoed, board members clamoring for his resignation, stock prices dipping, Victor's gloating voice on the news, but Edward had tuned it out. He'd made his choice under those blinding lights, and now he'd live it, not in speeches or headlines, but here, in the shadow of a life he'd abandoned. He knocked, the sound sharp against the weathered door. Anna opened it, her face a mask, of exhaustion and suspicion, her faded sweater hanging loose on her frame. "Edward," she said, her voice tight. "What now?" "I'm not here to talk," he replied, keeping his tone steady, his posture unthreatening. "I'm here to stay. For Tommy. For as long as you'll let me." He lifted the duffel slightly, a silent testament to his intent. Her eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind them. "You don't get to just walk in here and play house," she snapped, her restraint fraying. "This isn't your world. You don't belong." "I know," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "But I'm asking to try, not for me, for him." His voice softened, but his resolve held firm, a steel thread beneath the calm. Anna hesitated, then stepped aside, her silence a reluctant concession. The apartment swallowed him whole, narrow walls, a single bulb flickering overhead, the faint hum of a radio in the corner. Tommy sat on the couch, his wheelchair parked nearby, a book open on his lap. He looked up, those hazel eyes widening with surprise. "Mr. Edward?" he said, his voice small but curious. "You're back?" "Yeah," Edward said, setting the duffel down and crouching to his level. "I thought I'd stick around this time. If that's okay with you." Tommy glanced at Anna, then back at Edward, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Okay," he said simply, and returned to his book. Anna watched from the doorway, arms crossed, her silence louder than words. Edward didn't push her. He'd spent a lifetime bending people to his will, but here, he'd wait. Dignity wasn't in forcing his way, it was in earning it, step by quiet step. The first evening was awkward, a dance of strangers in a shared space. Edward unpacked his bag in the corner, claiming a sliver of floor beside the couch. Anna cooked dinner, pasta from a dented pot, sauce from a jar, and he offered to help, his hands clumsy with the unfamiliar task. She waved him off, her movements brisk, but he stayed nearby, watching, learning. When Tommy struggled to reach the table, Edward lifted the wheelchair's edge, gentle and unhurried, easing him into place. After dinner, he sat with Tommy, the boy's book, a weathered copy, of The Hobbit, open between them. "Want me to read?" Edward asked, his voice low, testing the waters. Tommy nodded, and Edward began, his deep voice weaving through Tolkien's words. He stumbled over names, his tongue unused to storytelling, but Tommy didn't mind, his eyes bright with the tale. Anna lingered in the kitchen, pretending to clean, but Edward caught her pausing, listening. When he finished a chapter, Tommy yawned, and Edward helped him into bed, his hands careful on the boy's thin frame. Later, alone with Anna in the dim living room, he tried again. "I can pay for a better place," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Or medical bills. Whatever you need." She turned from the sink, her eyes flashing. "I don't need your money, Edward," she said, her voice low but fierce. "I never did. I need a father for Tommy, not a damn sponsor. The rebuke stung, but he didn't rise to it. He'd faced boardroom tirades and kept his cool. This was no different, except it was. I'm trying, Anna, he said, his words measured. Honest, I don't know how to do this, but I'm here. Tell me what he needs. She stared at him, her anger softening into something rawer, grief maybe, or exhaustion. Time, she said finally. He needs time, not promises you won't keep. Edward nodded, absorbing the weight of it. I'll give him that, he said, his voice steady. As much as he'll take. The next morning, Anna handed him a notebook, yellowed, edges curling, before she left for work. Read it, she said, her tone clipped. Then decide if you're staying. Alone with Tommy still asleep, Edward opened it. It was Anna's journal, written in her neat slanting hand, pages filled with a decade of quiet despair. Tommy's first word was Mama. I cried because you weren't there to hear it. He asked about his dad today. I said you were busy, far away. It's easier than the truth. I wrote to you, Edward, 10 years ago. I begged you to come back. For him. You never did. I hope you never see this. The words gutted him, each line a testament to her strength and his failure. The letter, she'd sent it, and Victor had stolen it, but she'd kept writing, pouring her heart into a void he'd created. Edward closed the notebook, his hands steady, but his chest hollow. He'd abandoned them, not by intent, but by absence, and the dignity he'd clung to felt like a lie. When Anna returned that evening, he met her at the door, the journal in hand. I read it, he said, his voice low, unshaken. I didn't know, Anna. But I'm here now. I'm not leaving. She searched his face, her eyes glistening but hard. You don't get to erase it with words, she said, her tone cutting. Prove it. I will, he replied, calm, resolute. Day by day. She didn't answer, just brushed past him, to check on Tommy. Edward stood there, rain tapping the window, the small roof above him a fragile shelter against the storm he'd unleashed. He'd come to atone, not with wealth or grand gestures, but with the one thing he'd withheld. Himself. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. A vow forged in the silence of a life he was only beginning to understand. Edward Sullivan stood in the lobby of Tommy's Hope, the rehabilitation center he'd funded with a quiet portion of his fortune. The building gleamed with newness, white walls, wide windows, the hum of therapists and children filling the air. It was his first public act since the press conference, a legacy not of power, but of purpose, named for the boy who'd changed everything. Today was the grand opening, and Edward wore a simple suit, no tie, his presence understated amid the crowd of donors and families. He'd invited Anna and Tommy, hoping they'd see it, hoping it might mean something. Anna arrived late, Tommy's wheelchair rolling smoothly over the polished floor. She'd agreed to come reluctantly, her face a mask of guarded curiosity. Tommy's eyes lit up at the sight of the art room, a corner Edward had insisted on, stocked with paints and easels. This is cool, Tommy said, his voice bright, and Edward felt a flicker of warmth pierce the tension he carried. He guided them through the space, his voice low as he explained the vision. A place for kids like Tommy to heal, to grow. Anna listened, arms crossed, her silence a wall he couldn't yet breach. He didn't push. Dignity, he'd learned, was in the waiting, not the demanding. But as they reached the entrance, a shadow fell across the moment. Victor Crane stepped through the doors, his tailored coat impeccable, his smile a razor's edge. Edward's pulse quickened, but his face remained still, a mask of calm honed. Over decades, Victor had no business here. This was Edward's domain now, not the boardroom they'd once battled over. Well, Ed, Victor said, his voice smooth, loud enough to draw eyes. Quite the little redemption project. Too bad. It won't last. Anna tensed beside him, her hand tightening on Tommy's wheelchair. Edward stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but his gaze steel. What do you want, Victor? He asked, his tone even, betraying none of the fire beneath. Victor's smile widened, a predator scenting blood. Just came to see the show, and to tell you I've got investors pulling out. They don't trust a man who can't keep his secrets or his temper. This place will be bankrupt in a year. Thought you should know. The crowd murmured, heads turning, but Edward didn't flinch. He'd faced Victor's games before, leaks, sabotage, whispered lies, and won by staying above them. This was different, though. This wasn't about stocks or power. It was about Tommy, about the fragile trust he'd begun to build. He took a slow breath, mastering the urge to lash out. "You're welcome to try," he said, his voice low, steady. "But this isn't your fight anymore," Victor laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. "You think you're noble now, Ed? Throwing money at your guilt? I know you better than that. Remember when you cut me loose? 15 years ago, right after you left her?" He nodded toward Anna, his eyes glinting. "I was your best friend, your partner, and you ditched me for that chair. I lost everything, my job, my family, because you wouldn't share the spotlight." The words hit like a thunderclap, a truth Edward had buried deep. 15 years ago, Victor had been his confidant, a brilliant strategist who'd helped him climb. But when the chairman's seat opened, Edward had pushed him aside, fired him coldly to secure his own ascent. He'd told himself it was business, survival. But now, with Victor's venom laid bare, he saw the cost. Another betrayal, another life he'd left in ruins. Anna's gaze shifted to him, sharp with questions, but Edward kept his focus on Victor. "I was wrong," he said, his voice calm, resolute, loud enough for the room to hear. "I hurt you, Victor, and I'm sorry. But this," he gestured to the center, "isn't about me. It's about them. You want revenge? Take it. Just leave this alone." Victor blinked, caught off guard by the apology, the lack of fight. The crowd stilled, watching, but Edward stood firm, his hands loose at his sides. He wouldn't strike back, not with anger, not with power. That was the old Edward, the one who'd lost everything that mattered. Victor recovered, his sneer returning. "Too late for sorry, Ed. I'll bury this place, and you with it." Before Edward could respond, Tommy's voice cut through, small but clear. "Why do you hate him so much?" he asked, his wheelchair rolling forward, his eyes fixed on Victor. "He's trying to help, isn't that enough?" Victor faltered, the boy's innocence disarming him. Edward crouched beside Tommy, his hand resting lightly on the wheelchair. "It's okay, Tommy," he said, his voice soft. "He's got his reasons." "No," Tommy said, shaking his head. "I like it here. I want him to stay, not out there fighting." The words pierced Edward, a child's plea stripping away the last of his defenses. He looked up at Anna, her eyes glistening, but steady, then back at Victor. "You heard him," he said, rising, his tone final. "I'm done fighting you. I've got something better to do." Victor's smirk faded, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Tommy's words and Edward's quiet resolve. He turned, stalking out without another word, the crowd parting silently. Edward exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders, but the victory felt hollow. He'd faced his past, owned it, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Anna stepped closer, her voice low. "You meant that? About staying?" "Yes," he said, meeting her gaze. "But only if you'll let me. No money, no control, just me." She studied him, her guard softening, then nodded once. "Prove it," she said, echoing her earlier challenge, but this time with a flicker of trust. Edward smiled, faint but real, and turned to Tommy. "What do you say we paint something?" he asked, his voice warm. Tommy grinned, and as they moved toward the art room, Edward felt the shadows lift just a little. Victor could scheme, the world could judge, but here, beneath this small roof, he'd found a fight worth winning, one waged with patience, not power, for a family he'd finally chosen to claim. Edward Sullivan pushed Tommy's wheelchair along the winding path of Flushing Meadows Park, the late afternoon sun casting golden streaks across the grass. It was a year since the chaos of the press conference, since Victor's venomous exit from Tommy's Hope, and the world Edward had once ruled felt like a distant memory. He'd resigned as chairman of Sullivan Energy 6 months ago, handing the reins to a successor with a handshake and no fanfare. The penthouse was sold, its cold elegance replaced by a modest house in Queens, a single-story brick home with a ramp he'd built himself, his hands blistered but steady. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves, and Tommy laughed as a squirrel darted past, his voice bright against the quiet. Edward smiled, a rare, unguarded thing, and adjusted the blanket over Tommy's legs. "You warm enough?" he asked, his tone soft, practiced now in the rhythm of care. "Yeah," Tommy said, tilting his head back to look at him. "Can we stop by the water?" Edward nodded, steering them toward the lake, the wheelchair's wheels humming over the pavement. Anna walked beside them, her steps slow, her faded coat swapped for a new one Edward had slipped into her closet, without a word. She'd noticed, of course, her sharp eyes missed nothing, but she hadn't protested, a silent shift in the trust between them. They settled by the water's edge, the lake shimmering under the sinking sun. Tommy pulled a sketch pad from his bag, his fingers nimble with the pencil Edward had sharpened that morning. "Gonna draw the ducks," he said, already lost in the lines. Edward watched him, marveling at the boy's focus, the way he turned the ordinary into something alive. It was a gift Edward hadn't given him, but one he'd come to cherish. Anna sat on the bench beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "You're good at this now," she said, her voice low, teasing almost. "Pushing that chair like you were born to it," he chuckled, a sound he barely recognized as his own. "Took long enough," he replied, his gaze on Tommy. "I was a mess at first. Remember that time I got the wheel stuck in the mud?" She smiled, faint but real. "You cursed under your breath for 10 minutes, thinking we didn't hear." "I knew you did," he said, meeting her eyes. "Just didn't want to admit it." The ease between them was new, fragile, built over months of quiet persistence. Edward had stayed after Victor's threat, not with grand gestures, but with the steady presence Anna had demanded. He'd learned to change Tommy's bandages, to cook pasta without burning it, to sit through silences without filling them with plans or promises. He'd faced the board's fallout, lawsuits, stock dips, whispers of ruin, with the same calm he'd brought here, letting it go because this mattered more. Tommy's hope had survived Victor's sabotage, too. Edward's resignation had freed up funds, and a few loyal investors had stayed, drawn by the center's quiet success. It thrived now, a haven for kids like Tommy, its walls lined with his paintings, ducks, trees, a man under a lamp who no longer looked so lonely. Edward visited weekly, not as a benefactor but as a volunteer, his hands steady as he handed out brushes or pushed wheelchairs. Anna broke the silence, her voice softer now. "I got a call from the center today. They're naming the art room after him, Tommy's gallery. Did you know?" Edward shook his head, a flicker of pride warming his chest. "No, that's all him. He earned it." She studied him, her eyes tracing the lines of his face. Older now, softer at the edges. "You've changed, Edward," she said. Not a question, but a fact. "I didn't think you could." He looked at her, the woman he'd left and found again, and felt the weight of her words settle deep. "I was wrong about a lot," he said, his voice steady, honest. "I thought dignity was power, control, winning. I was wrong. It's this." He nodded toward Tommy. "The lake. Her. Sticking around when it's hard. I should have figured that out sooner." Anna's hand brushed his, a fleeting touch, but she didn't pull away. "You're here now," she said, echoing his own vow from months ago. "That's something." Tommy finished his sketch, holding it up with a grin. "Look, the ducks look funny today." Edward leaned over, inspecting the page. Ducks waddling in a crooked line, the water rippling behind them. "Perfect," he said, his voice warm. "You've got an eye for the real stuff." Tommy beamed, then paused, his gaze shifting between them. "Can I call you something else?" he asked, his tone tentative. "Not Mr. Edward?" "Edwards." Breath caught, but he kept his face calm, his hands resting lightly on his knees. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, though he knew. "Hoped." "Dad," Tommy said, simple and sure, the word landing like sunlight after a long night. Edward's eyes stung, but he didn't blink, didn't falter. He nodded, his voice thick but steady. "Yeah, Tommy. I'd like that." Anna's hand tightened around his, a silent anchor, and Edward felt the last of his old self, the cold, solitary man, slip away. He'd lost an empire, but he'd gained this, a family, a purpose, a dignity forged not in boardrooms, but in the small, steady acts of love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber, Edward pushed Tommy's wheelchair back toward home, Anna at his side. The house waited, a modest roof, a ramp he'd built, a life he'd chosen. He thought of Victor, of the battles he'd walked away from and felt no regret. The light of dignity wasn't in the spotlight, he'd learned. It was here, in the laughter of a boy who called him Dad, in the hand that held his without asking, in the legacy of a center that carried on without his name. "I was wrong," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Thinking honor was something you wear. It's what you give. Anna squeezed his hand, her voice a whisper against the dusk. "You found it, Edward. Right here." And as they walked on, the city fading into the distance, Edward knew she was right. The light wasn't at the end of some grand hall. It was beneath this small roof in the family he'd fought to reclaim, in the man he'd become at last. If you've enjoyed this journey of heart, honor, and redemption, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Your support keeps these stories coming, and I'd love to have you along for the next one. Let's keep exploring what it means to find light in the toughest moments, together.